any type of armor. How about prehistoric or current wildlife? Autos of all shapes and sizes and genres. Seafaring subjects of all types. And figures, vignettes, and dioramas. Then this group was made for you.
Now, where are we in the story of the Catalinas in World War II? In week one, we talked about the absolute defeat at Pearl Harbor and how we got kicked clean out of the Philippines, and then how the Japanese just ran roughshod all down. I'm doing part 3 tonight, Gene. So, and then ran roughshod down, through Singapore and everything else. They took over the Dutch East Indies and they were taking over everything. They seemed unstoppable. Last week, we started the battle in the Solomons and how they were really kind of kicking us all the way out of there. They were building airfields for land-based aircraft to support their naval expedition all the way down through the South Pacific till they got here. And they had spread all the way down. They were building an airfield. We called it eventually Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. But their goal was to continue this southeastern move so that they could, Australia was down over here, and this series of islands is to the northwest of Australia, and then you also have New Britain and New Ireland come out this way. There's New Guinea and so on, Borneo. And then as this series of islands continues down to San Cristobal, and then you get down to the islands to the south. And the Japanese had designs to move all the way down these, including those others, and take over Fiji and New Britain and all the way down to Samoa to blockade basically Australia from being supported by the Americans. And gee, nope. Part 2 was last week. Gene, yeah, I think you may have missed part 1, and you did join us last week, Gene, but this is part 3 tonight. So in any event, thus began the battle for the Solomon Islands. And the Americans, we saw the opportunity, we took it, we landed at Tulagi, we landed at Guadalcanal, and within the first day, all of our objectives on both of those landings were met. We moved some Seabees and engineers in and started fortifying Henderson Field. Well, we didn't completely run the Japanese off of Guadalcanal. They basically remained on this northern tip, and they were fighting fiercely. Their goal was to take over Henderson Field and continue their march to the south to Fiji and on down all the way to Samoa. Well, I left off last week at the September-October timeframe, 1942, and I stopped just shy of telling you 2 things because it kind of leads into where we get for the next 6 months. Solomon Islands, hotly contested. The fight down the slot, the Tokyo Express, they continue to launch out of Bougainville and from New Britain and New Ireland, and the Japanese ships are running down the slot in what we call the Tokyo Express, fortifying their outposts on all these islands and fortifying the troops that are on Guadalcanal trying to take Henderson Field. Well, on 20 September 1942, Vice Admiral John McCain was relieved of command by Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch became the commander of Air Southern Pacific, Commerce OPAC. Now, John McCain had really endeared himself to all the air component commanders and pilots and crews, especially in the PBY Catalina groups. He would show up unannounced with no fanfare, no press, no gaggles of, there's always the supporting cast of bootlickers that come with admirals. He'd show up with none of that and would quietly climb aboard an airplane and go fly a mission with them. And that really endeared him with the men. They loved that, and they loved flying with him. And he would sit quietly in a seat, and he would go on the same missions, make the same observations, take the same fire, put his neck on the line just like they did. And the pilots and crew dearly loved Admiral McCain because of that. Well, when Aubrey Fitch took over, he was still a good leader, but a different sort of leader. He was big on delegating things down to, my goodness, my wife and her girlfriends are now in a text war, and I am going to get rid of all notifications. So he was big at delegating things out to his leads of various areas and completely dependent on their feedback. And so he would push these things out, take information back, but he also liked to hear from the men at the front. And not John McClane, John McCain, Steve. So what Admiral Fitch would do was, after a mission was flown, he would invite one of the pilots and maybe a navigator to come to his tent and tell him about that mission. How did it go? Where did it go? What did they do? What did they see? What was the resistance like? And get a lot of the details about it so that he knew what the men were going through, where the toughest part of the defenses of the Japanese and the potential for offensive measures lie. And so he took the information in a little different form, but he was becoming well loved by the troops fairly early. Right about that time, on 18 October 1942, one other major change of command took place, and that was Vice Admiral William Halsey Jr. became Commander Southern Pacific. He owned all of it. And Vice Admiral Halsey was, there's been biographies written on him called Fighting Sailor and some others. William Halsey was a scrapper. He was a fighter. And he pulled no punches. And his whole, Bull Halsey, Fred knows his nickname. So Bull Halsey, he came in, and his prescription for victory in the Southern Pacific, he said, kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. That was his prescription for victory in the Southern Pacific. He left very little to be misunderstood. So he took over 18 October 42. Now, during the period I'm talking about, from October to March of 43, in this period of time, VP-12 became the very first squadron of PBYs to be formally designated as a Black Cat squadron. And they set up specifications for the mission, the operating environment, and the aircraft. You remember at the tail end of last week, I told you some of the crews took soap and lamp black and mixed that together, and they were literally using mops and sponges and swabbing it onto the aircraft to turn the blue aircraft black so they could hide at night. And out came the name from one of the harassment missions, where the guy flew over Henderson Field to go harass the Japanese at the northern end of Guadalcanal. And his cryptic message to the commander, not to get shot down as he went over Henderson, was, "The Black Cat flies tonight." And so that's one of about 3 stories as to the origin of the name Black Cats, but there they were. And so now, with this formal declaration, what Admiral Fitch did was they put down a set of parameters. And they said, okay, for a Black Cat aircraft to be assigned to a squadron designated Black Cats, the aircraft had to be outfitted with radar. It had to be outfitted with a radio altimeter. They had to have the dual torpedo launching sight system on it. All machine guns, any 30 cals like the tunnel gun and nose guns, removed, all replaced with 50 cal. And the aircraft had to be painted in a non-reflective black paint, and all serial numbers. And if you look at the national insignias, the white area behind the star and along the bars, those were toned way down, and serial numbers and tail numbers were basically obliterated. They wanted nothing on the aircraft that could reflect searchlights, moonlight, or what have you, that would give away their position. And so with these designations came formally the Black Cats. VP-12 was the first squadron to receive that designation. So they were operating down here south of San Cristobal at Espiritu Santo off the Fiji Islands. And they were also at Nandi Island. And so what they did was they said, okay, we're going to be moving up into the Solomons out of the other set of islands down here. And we're going to be moving to the Solomons, basically Henderson Field. And they took half of their aircraft and put them up there. Half of them operated out of Espiritu Santo on Fiji. And they would operate in Henderson for 3 to 4 weeks and then swap. Crews, not sometimes aircraft too, but basically aircraft remained where they were at. Crews would swap every 3 to 4 weeks. And that was the rhythm that they set up with us. Well, at this period of time, we're now October, and we're talking about October through March. So it's winter time, but it's south of the equator. So it's kind of warm. You know, there are some nights. You guys remember back several months when people kept trying to go into my room and kicking me off? If I get one more damn interruption, sorry. So from October, November, December, all the way into March, it's not really cold, but man, is it rainy. And you've got typhoon season. And so these guys are down there. It's just rainy. It's kind of miserable. The weather's terrible. On Henderson, at Henderson Field, the car warranties. If I get one more of those calls. Anyway, Guadalcanal, the place was under all that rain. It was black mud, this green putrid water everywhere, and they were just havens for mosquitoes and other flying, biting insects, and they spread, malaria. Guys were getting dysentery. Pilots regularly, navigators, co-pilots, the crew, the mechanics, the gunners, people regularly were flying with fever and chills and diarrhea because there was no one else to take the mission. And the way they set themselves up was you would fly a mission every third night. So you basically had 3 crews per plane that was there, right? And so you would fly tonight, have 2 nights off, fly the third night, 2 nights off, and so on. And that was their rhythm. And so when it was your turn to fly, it didn't matter if you had the fever, the chills, dysentery, diarrhea, you were flying. And these are the conditions these guys were dealing with. And one of the commanders came to Henderson Field, and he wanted to see the conditions under which his people were operating. And Big Navy, they had decided that Henderson Field was only going to be temporary. We were going to kick the Japanese out of the Solomons. Our goal, once we got to Bougainville, was to step off and go get them at Rabaul up to the northwest. And that was their major base where everything the Japanese were doing was coming out of, was Rabaul. And so once we ran them out of the Solomons, off of Bougainville, out of Rabaul, we were going to just shove them all the way back to Japan. So Guadalcanal, Henderson Field was temporary. And they were not going to invest the time, the money, the materials to put any sort of permanent, quartering or living conditions there. So these guys are living in tents in this black swamp of putrid green water. And the Japanese are harassing them by night. The washing machine Charlie and some other raids that would come at night dropping bombs. Whenever the Tokyo Express came down with the fast destroyers, they'd sit off the coast and shell. And so guys are constantly having to, run and jump into their foxholes. And that was the conditions. And your foxholes always full of water. Some guys just chose to build large fighting holes, foxholes, and sleep out there instead of in the tent. But you couldn't, because it would be full of water. If you fell asleep and slumped over, you could drown, or worse, inhale that putrid water. So this commander comes out and he wants to see their living conditions, and other, leaders at Henderson were kind of resisting it. And this commander took a flight, a mission with the team, flew out throughout the night, lands early in the morning, and then he got a tour of their living conditions by one of the crews. And when he went around and saw the conditions under which these people were living, he went back and he reported to Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch. And when Fitch learned what the men were living under who were flying these missions, he ordered the Seabees to get in there and begin, building something habitable. And so that was November when that that was identified and the CBs were sent in. And it took a couple of months to finally get living places, a chow hall, mess hall, living facilities, tents, permanently there, things bulldozed, ground built up and reinforced so you weren't in that black mud, but on top of rock and stuff so it could drain through that and keep the surface dry or drier for people. And it wasn't until like mid-January that all of their living conditions were actually upgraded. But the people knew it was coming, and through January, and so frankly, their morale was very high, despite all of those conditions. These guys were taking daily atabrine tablets as part of a preventative measure. And despite taking daily atabrine and other medications, at one point there was like 85% of the squadron was infected with malaria or dysentery or a combination of both. But that was their conditions. In the meantime, we had just taken over, Tulagi, Guadalcanal. That was September into October of 1942. Well, the Japanese up at Bougainville, at the northern end, there's an inlet down here that kind of runs northeast, and that inlet is called Tonale Harbor. And at Tonale Harbor, the Japanese started a massive fleet buildup in there. We discovered it one night on a long-range mission. Flew a cat up there, went over it at night, saw this place full of ships, combat vessels. So it was reported, and what they did was on the Japanese from that were flowing down through the slot with the Tokyo Express, and they were coming down and replenishing the troops on the northern tip of Guadalcanal from that. And so they're trying to keep fortifying them, and they sent ships down on the night of the 15th of October. The whole period, the 20th through the 26th of October, they're just fortifying those people, trying to keep them well stocked with ammunition and food, beans, band-aids, and bullets, right? So that's what was happening there. On the night of October 22nd, we launched 3 PBYs from all the way down at Espiritu Santo, down in the Fiji Islands. And it is a 900-mile flight from Espiritu Santo to Tonale Harbor. Even with the legs on a PBY, they couldn't make it all the way back. So the mission was set up. What they did was they flew outside of the Solomons, over water, the entire mission, over 900 miles to duck in, and then they came back down the slot and landed at Tulagi to refuel before continuing on home to Espiritu Santo. That was the mission. And the way they set it up was they put a torpedo, 2,200 pounds, Mark 13, under the left wing, 2 500-pound bombs under the right wing, a number of flares in the aircraft, loaded up all the 50 cals, and they take off. So they flew west of the Solomons. They took off, flew to the west over water. Then, to make sure that their surprise was absolute, the last 150 miles, they flew those 3 cats loaded with a torpedo and 2 500-pound bombs at 20 feet off the water. 150 miles. That was the capability of these aircraft, even on that day, 22 October 1942. Well, there's a whole bunch of little islands that I didn't depict them on here because it just become real cluttered, but there's a whole number of little bitty islands leading up to that. And so the cat cruise, I told you last week that the sight for the torpedo sat on the dash between the pilot and the co-pilot. You had 2 sights and 1 center line, so that depending on which guy was, making the mission, you would use this sight with the center line or this sight with the center line for lining up a torpedo attack. And sometimes they would set the torpedo to be armed at 200 yards, sometimes at like 400, 600, 1,000 yards, what have you. And so these guys were taken to putting grease pen marks on the windscreen so that when I'm looking at the sight properly and I needed for the sight to align to a 200-yard drop, it'd be on this hash mark, or a 400 would be on that hash mark. This is what these guys are doing. And so as they're making their approach to Tonelli Harbor at 20 feet off the water, there's these little islands, and they're using them like ships to practice seeing when the marks would come in for a 200-yard drop or a 600-yard drop. So they're kind of flowing along all these islands, practicing torpedo runs on their way to get the Japanese fleet. Well, they arrive just after 1 o'clock in the morning, and lo and behold, there's a destroyer, was a sentinel right in the mouth of the harbor. So all three planes have to kind of pop up and over the destroyer and back down. And as soon as they clear the destroyer and they're in the harbor, they break off and go looking for their own individual targets. I mean, that was the mission brief. You get in, get a target, get out. So these guys, the lead airplane comes up and over the destroyer. We've now alerted the Japanese were there. And he turns, and lo and behold, right there in front of him is this big, beautiful cruiser. Well, the problem is the cruiser is not silhouetted against the sky. It's silhouetted against the harbor. So it's tough to see, you know, the bow and the tail, and to use the tick marks. So they're really struggling with getting lined up for a 200-yard drop. And 200 yards when you're flying 125 miles an hour goes by pretty quick. They're approaching this cruiser, and they release the torpedo, and it hits the water, and he pulls back on the yoke, and as he does, has a brilliant idea. Boom, boom, he salvos the two 500-pounders. Well, the torpedo evidently just ran afoul, hit the mud. It didn't do anything. No torpedo hit. But as they broach up and over the cruiser, one of the 500-pounders hits that cruiser amidships. Boom! Second one goes a little long, lands on the harbor dock area. Who knows what it may have destroyed there. 500-pound bombs make an awful mess, however. Dash 2, he had broken. He rolls out, and he's looking almost broadside at a big, beautiful cruiser himself. He lines up 600 yards, drops his fish, starts to ease back on the stick, and as he's coming up over the cruiser, right on the other side of it is a destroyer sitting in the same harbor. Well, the observers in the blisters, who are now starting to fire as they're raking across stuff, they notice, you can see the churn from the propellers on the torpedo. They see the churn of the fish, and it goes wham right into the side of the cruiser. Nothing. Left one heck of a big churn and wake and splash where it hit the boat. Who knows what kind of damage it may or may not have inflicted. Cruisers are, you know, at least a standard or a heavy cruiser, they're just shy of a battleship, you know, but boom, that torpedo hit it. It probably dented it, woke up a bunch of people, but just over that was a destroyer. And as he's pulling up, it gives that, you know, throw to the bombs, and he releases both of those bombs in a salvo, and those 500-pounders head over, and one hit just after the destroyer, but the second one hit that thing, and probably in the magazine on the boat, because both the blister gunners reported that as they went over that destroyer, it exploded, and it exploded big and broke in half and sank. So they think they probably hit that thing in a magazine. Two cruisers hit with dud torpedoes, and a destroyer sunk, and in rolls number 3. And number 3 found what for that mission was the biggest boat in the harbor. They wanted carriers, of course. He sees this great big boat, and he's approaching it, and he's flat on the water. Well, now there's activity starting, even though they had split and gone separate ways. That area is awake, and they start shooting, which kind of gets these guys, and now that area is awake and shooting, and he's coming, and everything around them's going on, and he's heading. As it turns out, it's not a carrier. It was a great big transport. He made 2 mistakes, Dash 3 did. His first mistake was it was an armed transport. His second mistake was, as he approached it and let the fish go, when he pulled up, he too wanted to do the bomb toss on that big puppy. He dropped flares to light the ship up. Well, when he dropped the flares, guess what else it lit up? That's right, he lit himself up. and it was an armed transport, and all hell broke loose. And so he lost complete focus on dropping the bombs on the transport. He salvoed them just to get rid of them so he could get speed, have some maneuverability, and try to just get the hell out of there. All three planes, cruiser, destroyer, heavy transport, they all turned. The Japanese are firing like crazy. One guy described it as the 4th of July on steroids. But the PBYs all get back down on the water 20 feet off the deck. The Japanese have to depress their guns to fire at them. And guess what started happening? That's right. The Japanese were shooting each other because they're going after the PBYs at 20 feet. And these guys head for the mouth of Tonale Harbor, up and over the Sentinel, out, and they're racing for home. Dash 3, who lit himself up like a Christmas tree by dropping flares on his attack, took an awful lot of damage. Right wing wound up having a tremendous hole in it and ripped one of his tanks open. They already knew it was going to be close on gas. He leaned his engine way out. They flew home at about 1,000 feet, trying to remain, invisible to everybody else. Fortunately, all three aircraft made it back down to Tulagi, and that third plane had to undergo repairs. The other two continued on. The third made it later. All three survived. But boy, so that was the Black Cats' first assault on the enemy after their designation and going. So good first mission. Well, the Japanese responded to this. The Americans tried to fly another Tonale Harbor type mission the next night. And when they got up there, they hopped over a Sentinel that wasn't a destroyer. It was just like a trawler. Harbor completely empty. The Japanese had sortied every ship they had. And so we now knew that the Japanese fleet was at sea and we needed to get a fix on them. And they started looking for them for 3 days. The Japanese response was they sent 4 carriers, 4 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and all sorts of other assorted combat vessels. And they're coming south. But we don't know where they're at and we don't know where they're going. The Americans had 2 carriers, 2 battleships, 9 cruisers, and 24 destroyers in theater at that time to counter. The problem is we're all spreading out. We didn't have everything together as, a combatant force. They too were being spread out all over the Coral Sea, all over the Pacific Ocean, trying to find the Japanese. The Catalinas are flying missions daytime and night, trying to fix and find the Japanese fleet. One PBY saw a single destroyer one night way out over the Coral Sea. And even though they were told because of their vulnerabilities during the day not to attack a boat, or not to go into combat, to keep that for nighttime, he couldn't resist. He rolled over. All he had were depth charges, but he threw both of them at the destroyer. And he did. Nothing happened, but the destroyer kept steaming away. And it wasn't until the 3rd day later, on October 25th, that they finally found the Japanese fleet. And the message that came, VP11 and VP24 were doing all the searches. And searching for 3 days, they finally locate a good portion of it. And it was in the Pacific on the north and east. There were more down here, but what came from that, Admiral Halsey, his message, attack, repeat, attack. That was the only message he sent. What happened from there was called the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The Santa Cruz Islands, these are all the Solomon, and just over here a little bit further to the east were the Santa Cruz Islands. And that was where we met them. And the battle for the Santa Cruz Islands took place, and it happened 25, 26, 27 October. During that battle, the Japanese, we damaged the Zuiho, we damaged the Shokaku, and the Shokaku was damaged pretty heavily. We damaged the cruiser Chikuma, and it was even the destroyer Terazuki was damaged, but it was damaged by a PBY. The Terazuki got in along Melita at the northern end of the coast, and it was actually trying to sail back all the way up to the Tonale Harbor, but he was staying in the shadows along the coast to try to hide at night from the PBYs. And a cat caught him along Melita Island, dropped a torpedo on him with a good hit, and really didn't sink it. But the Teruzuki took tremendous damage and was out of commission for a long time, care of a PBY Black Cat. On the American side, however, we lost the Hornet. It was sunk. The South Dakota, which was a battleship, and some other surface vessels were damaged. And but the bottom line is that at this point, this is now October 1942. We're a year into the war, a little over 10 months. And our industrial capacity, our production is really ramping up. And we are pushing stuff as a nation into the South Pacific as quickly as humanly possible. And we, as unlike the Japanese, at this point, we are refilling our losses from these naval engagements. We're getting more and more aircraft into the theater where we had none up through September and October. It was nothing but PBYs. There weren't, P-40s and P-39s and, everything flying all over the place. We literally, our Air Force was several VP squadrons. That was it when the war kicked off. So we are getting forces daily. The Japanese are still numerically superior to us, but the equipment we're getting is technologically and capability-wise far superior. So a period of real uneasiness set in for the Japanese for about the next 3 months, because their advance, all of their plans to continue down to the southeast and to cut off Australia from America, that's not only been halted, now these major battles that take place, they're no longer winning, they're fighting to a draw. And so that's very disconcerting for the Japanese at this point. The naval battle, thanks, Mark, I appreciate that comment, buddy. The naval battle of Guadalcanal took place in mid-November. Now, again, I said the Japanese sorted everything. They sortied everything, and you had the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Shortly after that, we had the naval battle for Guadalcanal. Now, the naval battle for Guadalcanal was also called the Third Battle of the Solomons. It was the third time carrier-to-carrier kind of combat had taken place. And so the naval battle for the Solomons, the naval battle for Guadalcanal goes mid-November. Heavy losses on both sides. But the Japanese objective was to fortify the men, get more men, more supplies on Guadalcanal to drive us off, get us out of Henderson Field, drive us off Guadalcanal, continue their march south. So they were successful in landing 2,000 more troops and a bunch of supplies on Guadalcanal, but they lost 11 transports and 2 battleships in the naval battle for Guadalcanal. U.S. losses were very light. We dealt it to them, boom, boom. Well, less than 2 weeks later, on 30 November, you have the battle for Tessafaronga. And at the battle for Tessafaronga, the Americans lost the cruiser Northampton. 3 other cruisers were damaged. A couple of destroyers were damaged. And the Japanese lost 1 destroyer. So, battle for Guadalcanal, boom, we punch them hard. Battle of Tessafaronga, boom, they hit us back. You got this whole seesaw thing going in October, November, December. But the point is, the Japanese are no longer advancing. Their designs to take over the South Pacific has now not only been blunted, it's at a fighting standstill, which they did not expect. They knew at this point, and most of the battle at Tessafaronga took place at night, but the Japanese now knew that there was no more coming south down the slot unopposed, even at night. And it was costing them. And where it cost us, like it cost them, we were getting replenished. They were not. Everything they had was built before hostilities started. Everything we're now bringing to bear, we're being built after hostilities started. And it makes all the difference in the world when you're fighting a war like that. So the Japanese knew they still needed to fortify the soldiers who were fighting from the north end of Guadalcanal, trying to take Henderson Field. They haven't given up on that southward expansion, even though it's been blunted. So there was like 3 new things they started doing. Number one was they started sending fast destroyers down the slot. They'd run right into, we started calling this little strait between Tulagi and Guadalcanal, we started calling that Iron Bottom Sound. And they called it Iron Bottom Sound because of all the American and Japanese ships that were sunk there and became artificial reefs, just filling up with ironclads. Well, they would launch out of Tonale Harbor every night, or from New Georgia or Santa Isabel, and they would run south down the slot off the coast of Guadalcanal, and they would release floating drums of supplies. They literally were filling like 55-gallon drums, half full, half with air, cap it, seal it, throw it into the water, and let the beleaguered Japanese troops on Guadalcanal paddle out in little boats, hook these things and tow them ashore to open them up, and they would get a half a barrel of supplies. But the ships fast destroyers would come down, dump them, and split because the cats were pouncing them every time they came down there. The second tactic they tried was they would send submarines to release about the same thing. Floating drums the submarine would surface, release some stuff over the side, submerge, and try to sneak away. All of this under the cover of dark, avoiding the Black Cats. The last thing they tried was barges. They started building these barges. Some of them were just wood, cross-hatched wood design. Some of them were wood design on struts with 55-gallon drum, basically barrel floats. But a barge could basically, you think, hand paddling in the shadows of the land and along all the little islands in between, staying in the shadows, hiding along the shores where they'd be hard to be seen, to bring barges of supplies down to keep those guys replenished. And so it worked, but it didn't work. They were getting stuff there, but it wasn't fortifying them like they needed, and they certainly weren't getting replenished with men. By the time early February rolled around, the Japanese lost over 24,000 men at Guadalcanal. I mean, their losses are just astronomical. So this is what they're trying. And then finally, the Japanese command says, you know what? Coming from New Britain and Rabaul and what we had at Tonale on Bougainville, we need more to strike. So you come down here to New Georgia Islands, and this little peninsula down here, the bottom of that little thing was called Munda Point. The Japanese decided they're going to build an airfield at Munda Point to bring in land-based fighters and bombers and support these missions. And even later, off of another smaller island, they started building another airfield. All of this to get more aircraft down there to support their ships, because the Americans, the whole time, something was still out there at night. It was lurking. They never knew where it was going to strike. They never knew how it was going to strike. Torpedoes, bombs, depth charges, and it was painful. And those Black Cats were dealing the Japanese absolute fits. The solution: get more aircraft into the Solomons. So they start building these airfields. Well, as we head into December, the fighting is still going on. There's no real victory. I told you it's kind of seesaw back and forth. So among the Americans, there's no real sense of, celebration and happiness and joviality for the new year. Well, one of the squadrons, the VP-12, the Black Cats, decided that they would ring in 1943 with a bang. And somebody had told one of the pilots that when you drop an empty beer bottle at altitude, from a high altitude, it made this ominous, kind of eerie sound as it fell, the wind coming off the bottle. It made this really ominous, eerie sound. So the crew that had the New Year's Eve flight for 2 days while they were not flying, they had people drinking all the beer they could and collecting, don't break the bottles, don't throw them away, collecting all the bottles. And they're putting them in cartons that they can carry on the Catalina. So they're loading up on beer bottles and fragmentation grenades and fragmentation bombs and 500 pounders under the wings. And then they load the airplane up with flares. And they take off late at night on, December 31st, 1942. And they're going to go fly harassment missions on the airfield construction at Munda Point. So they get up there after dark, and they'd fly across Munda, and they'd drop some frags, maybe a stick of frags. They'd come back by a little later and drop a 500 pounder. Well, on the dashboard, on the instrument panel, on the dash of the PBY, each pilot and co-pilot had a thing called an 8-day clock. When you wound that up, hey Angel, when you wound that up, it ran for 8 days, and it had a countdown, both minutes, seconds, days. So ahead of this mission, they wound it up, got the clock set, and it was doing a countdown. So it reaches about 11:45, December 31st, 1942. And at 11:45, that pilot made a final pass by, dropped his last stick of frags, and they've got one 500 pounder, a whole bunch of beer bottles, and a whole mess of flares left on the airplane. They head out over the water a little bit, and they decide to come back in a west-east pass across Munda Point here in New Georgia. And as the 8-day clock winds down and finally it comes around and hits midnight, these guys toss all the beer bottles out of the airplane. They shooting off flares like it's cool, and click, off the wing goes the last 500 pounder. So they sent howling beer bottles, lighting them up with flares, the 500 pounder, boom! And they got relieved on station and flew home down to Henderson Field, and they landed and came off the airplane with such joviality that they were the first crew to bomb the Japanese in 1943. And that's how they flew in the new year. So I told you, the construction's taking place. They're getting real quarters and hooches and everything built up. And despite their living conditions, they're giving it as good as they're getting it, if not better, to the Japanese. And morale, despite the conditions, is really very high. And so all this stuff is going on. You want to know what happens back at base? These guys are lunatics. Radioman first class, his name was Henry Ledoux. He was kind of a plucky fellow and scrappy, loved fighting. He loved going after the Japanese. He loved being in a blister gun. He loved when they would set off flares and he could strafe targets, ships, destroyers, cruisers, didn't matter. One night in the harbor, his crew, Lieutenant Pack was his pilot. He's in the window on the blister, on the window gun, and they thought they were approaching a ship. They dropped the flare, and it turned out to be like an I-9. I think they said it was submarine. And so they dropped a fish on it. He's going over the top of this submarine. Flares going. He's shooting across a submarine. Dude was just scrappy. Well, on his 2 days off when they weren't flying missions, Radioman First Class Henry Ledoux would grab some buddies, and they'd leave Henderson Airfield and head over and join the Marines at the front, fighting the Japanese in the jungles of Guadalcanal. The Marines, these guys would show up. There was no skin off the Marines' nose if these guys got shot. They didn't belong to them. But these kids would show up. The Marines would hand him a rifle, and he's out there, fighting with the Marines. And he described one night they were up on a ridge, and it wasn't quite trench warfare, but there was a depression between, and they're looking at each other, and it's fighting. And Henry Ledoux raised himself enough that he got his upper, like the bust, silhouetted against the sky, not the forest. And they're about 150 yards from the Japanese, and a sniper took a nice little shot at him, and it hit close. And he said, he's out there and he's looking for the Japanese, and he heard the report, and just a split second later heard the pling of the round that darn near got him. He had to jump back down and get covered up, and the Marines are going, "You idiot." But this is how he passes the time between missions. You had the aviation machinist mate, first class Eddie Siebler. He became known among his fellow crew members as a master rat catcher. There were rats all over Guadalcanal. And this guy would take an ammo can and set it down upside down, prop it up with a stick to a string, and he'd put a little morsel from, the mess tent in there. And when the rat came along, he'd pull that stick with the string, and he's capturing rats. Sometimes they cleaned them up and cooked them and ate them. There was a black cat on the island that VP-12 adopted as their mascot, the Black Cats. And that they called the Black Cat Yardbird. And Yardbird flew some missions on the airplanes. Mainly he was back at main body. But they would get Yardbird where they had captured a rat with one of the ammunition buckets. They'd get Yardbird there and they'd open the bucket. So when the rat bolted, off goes Yardbird. Yardbird was well fed. He got scraps from the mess hall, in the mess tent. All the rats he could eat. Some people swore some of those rats were bigger than Yardbird, but evidently he held his own. So that was, this is what these guys are doing for fun between missions. For the deeper thinkers, there was a lot of guys that liked to play chess. And there was a red parrot that was indigenous to Guadalcanal. And a lot of guys spent time catching the red parrots and caging them. And they were trying to teach them how to speak. Now, according to the story that I was reading, if they were able to make some of those birds speak, anybody who followed after they left would probably blush at the language they were teaching those birds to use. But this is how they pass the time. And so with that morale, with the high morale, with the missions they're flying, these guys took to, you could tell the seniority or the number of missions and types of missions people flew by the symbols that they wore. When you got to the squadron, I told you they're there for 3 to 4 weeks, and then you'd swap out with the next group and so on. Some people stayed as part of the transition to the new group. Well, when you flew your first mission, you got the silhouette of a cat painted on a leather flight jacket on the side of your airplane. You would get the outline of a black cat. Your second mission, it would get eyes and whiskers. On the third mission, the cat's toes got claws, and so on. So as you flew more missions, more of your cat was filled out. But the irony was, if you flew a torpedo mission, the cat was given an appendage of a little more personal nature, if you will. That's how you knew the guys that flew the torpedo missions against the Japanese ships. And this is how these guys are passing the time. So the new year rolls in, morale is high. Swap out commanders. There was a lieutenant who was there leading the group. Well, now the actual CO of the squadron, Commander Taft, he shows up, and he's going to lead them through the rest of their deployment on Guadalcanal. And now when he gets there, he implements a thing called the Mike search. Again, Japanese shipping, the destroyers, the barges, all this time, October, November, December, January, with the shutdown of the shipping, barges became a big deal. They're really trying to keep people replenished by them. And so the Mike search, they would take off out of Henderson Airfield, and they would fly basically north across Tulagi until they got to Melita, at which point they'd turn northeast and fly along the coast of Santa Isabella, almost up to Choiseul, where they'd come back to the southwest at the north end of New Georgia, and then they would skirt all of New Georgia on the way back down to Henderson, and then they'd turn and do it again. But the next lap was done on the outside of the islands, where they would look for the barges, the shipping, and that became the Mike search pattern. It was roughly 300 miles or so round trip. Those took about 3 hours, flying about 100 miles an hour, 300-mile trip, 3-hour lap. And each of those nights missions were about 11 hours between takeoff, getting up, setting up. Sometimes you'd have to go inspect something that you saw. So you'd get off of your flight path a little bit. So about 11-hour missions overall. That became the Mike search. Well, on 4 January 1943, 2 cats were sent to go do naval gunfire bombardment spotting. And so they were sent for the cruisers, the Nashville and the St. Louis, and 2 destroyers, the Fletcher and the O'Bannon. And they were up here at Munda Point trying to give the Japanese what for. They're building the airfield there. And just like in August and September, where the Japanese came down here and sat off in Iron Bottom Sound off the north end of Henderson and shelled the Marines and all the aircraft there with just relentless night after night shelling. It was now time for the Americans to give as good as they got. And so those 4 ships sail up to New Georgia and get to Munda Point, and 2 cats were sent to spot for them. And these ships get up off the coast. The cruisers have 6-inch guns. The destroyers have 5-inch guns. And they lobbed a couple of shells. The cats, who were up at, about 5,000 and 10,000 feet for this particular mission, they radioed down to the ships to adjust the fire. A couple more shells were lobbed right in the sweet spot. And it's like, okay, fire at will. I don't know who Will was, but if he was at Munda Point, it was a 20-minute solid sheet of fire from ship to shore. And they were just given what we had gotten at Henderson Field all over Munda Point. 20 minutes solid fire at that point, destroying the Munda airfield construction. Well, that stuff was really kind of working. So you fast forward just about 10 more days, 14 January, 3 cats were going to be sent out on a Mike search mission. I'm telling you, the weather, I told you, the rain, this is a rainy season, it's really bad. And on the 14th of January was one of those nights where the weather was just unbelievable. 3 cats take off. The first one couldn't even get out of a front in the squall, and he turns around and heads right back to base. The second plane flew about half of the Mike search pattern and called no join and returns home and lands. The third plane, he made the full first pass on the Mike run. And as they're approaching Guadalcanal, and he goes to turn from his southeasterly trek to head back to the northeast. And as he's making the turn, the navigator who is in the airplane, now mind you, when a Catalina goes to take off and they're in the water, and you start just moving through the water with the bow, the aircraft, the prop, and the wash, it throws water after water after water on the plane until they get up on the step and then take off. So as they're coming south and then turn back to the north, the navigator comes up on the intercom to the pilot and he goes, "Hey, are you going to take off for this mission at all? Or are you just going to taxi through the whole thing?" Because they were just in rain and rain and rain. It was like they never got off the water, this poor guy. So I'm going to talk about weather here in a second, but weather was rapidly becoming just their biggest enemy. 16 January, 2 more cats take off for a night bombing at Kahili up on Bougainville, which is over here. Tonelli Harbor, like I said, kind of runs northeast. Well, Tahili they were building another air base up there. They go after them with, each plane was carrying 8 500-pound bombs, 4 under each wing, big load. They had a number of 20-pound anti-personnel bombs on them. And then on the night of 24 January, they got another naval bombardment mission called in to go to Colombongara Island. They were at the Villa Plantation, another airfield being built. It's down here along Santa Isabel. And they go to Villa Plantation on Colombongara Island. And this time you had the cruisers Nashville and Helena, and it was a bunch of destroyers, the Nicholas, the De Haven, the Radford, the O'Bannon. They bombarded Colombongara Island and Villa Plantation for almost 35 minutes. Well, as the ships were approaching, the Japanese had launched out from Rabaul, had been flying down Santa Isabella. The air base is just on Colombongara Island, is off the coast of Santa Isabel. And the Japanese sent Bettys to try to, run the American ships off. Well, the Bettys got chased off by some other fighters from P-40s from the U.S. side. And then the cats show up, and they're directing the naval gunfire at this time from 15 and 20,000 feet. I doubt the Japanese even knew the cats were there, giving them the precise coordinates on where to adjust their gunfire and begin. 30 or 35 minutes of solid fire on Villa Plantation, just tearing it up. So these are the things that are going on. Now, addressing the weather, one of the cats on the night of 25 January, he had taken off in a squall, broke through into some clear. He's doing the mic search. Second lap, he's on the outer sides of the island, making his third lap. And when he's coming back, Henderson Field tells him, we're in a squall, just patrol to the west of us. We'll let you know when you can come in and land. So he's out to the west of Guadalcanal, hanging out over the Coral Sea. And he gets down to like 10 or 15 minutes fuel left. And this pilot decides that he's going to go ahead and put the plane down while he has power, so he doesn't have to dead stick in the chop and the wind and, all this. So he heads down and he gets the plane and he's starting to flare. Everything is open, but the toolbox to slow the plane down. He tries to set it down. Well, at about that time, there was a big wave and the plane hit it almost, head on. And when it hit the wave, it drew the plane down, and the next wave behind it, the PBY, like literally became, you ever gone body surfing and you go under the water as the wave comes over? That's what the PBY did. It literally was overcome by the wave. The whole plane was almost instantly filled with water. The empty fuel tanks in the wings were the only thing keeping this plane afloat. The cabin, the rest of it, they hadn't dogged any of the doors shut or anything like that. The plane was all opened up, filled with water. So everyone starts exiting the plane as fast as they can, getting out, and they get on the wing, which basically they're sitting on the surface of the ocean in the Coral Sea, and the navigator was missing. And they're waiting and they're looking, and like 10 minutes goes by, and they were all sure the navigator had drowned. And all of a sudden, his head pops up, coughing, sputtering, and they're able to reach him and pull him up onto the wing. And as it turns out, he was in his compartment, which is in a PBY, the sail where the wing is mounted. The navigator's compartment is just forward of that, behind the cockpit, that he shares with the radioman. And then you've got the mechanical operator sits in the sail. You've got the bunking compartment, and then the blister gunners are further aft, and the tunnel gunner farthest aft, back where the can is. Well, this guy was sitting in his navigator station, and when they hit that wave, he was thrown forward and knocked out. And when the plane filled with water, it sloshed and threw him up into the sail that holds the wing, and there was a bubble of air in the top of that sail, and he's unconscious in there, held up by the mechanic's seat till he comes to. Total darkness, doesn't really know where he's at, realizes he's in water and floating, and he takes a deep breath and starts fumbling his way through until he got out through a blister window and made it to the surface, and these guys pulled him up. So he survived. I mean, just incredible stuff. But the weather became the biggest enemy to all the cat operators about this time of year. So the conclusion to this period really is that on 1 February, the night of 1 to 2 February, the Japanese actually began the extraction, the withdrawal of their troops from Guadalcanal. The night of 1-2 February, they sent destroyers down. They lost 2 destroyers. They lost a number of barges. They sent transport ships. We sank like 2 or 3 of them the night of 1 to 2 February. They sent another group down on the 4th of February early, and overnight on the 7th and 8th of February was the final bit of the withdrawal. And if you hear what I'm telling you, all those Japanese plans for the expansion down to Fiji and Samoa to block Australia from reinforcements from America, the Japanese have finally abandoned. They're pushed south with their withdrawal from Guadalcanal. Now, a lot of people will tell you that Midway was the turning point in the Pacific War, right? And from a mindset standpoint, the Japanese were basically unbeatable, right? They whacked us at Pearl Harbor. They took over the Philippines. We were just destroying everything in their path. They were a steamroller. At Midway, with our advantage with breaking their code and pre-positioning our carriers to spring a trap, and the PBYs that found them, we sunk 4 carriers, a cruiser, and like a destroyer or 2. And from a materiel standpoint, that may have been a turning point in the war. But from a psychological, we hadn't launched we had the Doolittle raid that did little, but it was an attack on Japanese mainland Tokyo. Japanese moved some things around to prevent that from ever happening again, that kept them out of the front. Okay, so I mean, all these things had little effects, but I will tell you that the strategic objectives of the Japanese to take from Japan, the Kuril Islands across to the Aleutians in Alaska down to Midway, that was abandoned. But from the Aleutians to the Kurils to Japan, all the way down through Southwest Asia, to carve off and encircle Australia to block them from reinforcement from the Americans, so they would own the Pacific writ large. That was their goal. And everything, even the defeat at Midway, even the defeat losing originally Guadalcanal, even the battles in the Solomons, and those were all setbacks. They sunk the Lady Lax, they damaged the Yorktown, they sunk the Hornet here, and they were losing stuff left and right. But for the Japanese, that was all just setbacks. Their ultimate goal was in reach until they withdrew their troops from Guadalcanal and gave up on that strategic goal of expanding south. And I would tell you that was the one real turning point in the war, because not only had their expansionism, was it blunted? Now it was starting to roll back. And so I'll give you the wrap up for tonight from 15 October to 27 March. 15 October 1942, 27 March 43. All of tonight's information, the battle, these things that have taken place were flown by VP 11, VP 12, VP 51, VP 101 that was consolidated from 101 and 102 out of the Philippines and so on. But I'm just talking VP 12 now for the Black Cats, the first designated Black Cat Squadron. That squadron, half of which that was at Henderson, this is their tally for 6 months. 236 missions, totaling 1,660 hours. And those missions ranged from bombing and torpedo and naval gunfire liaison and direction, search for the enemy, convoy, anti-submarine, search and rescue. 6 months, 236 missions, 1,660 hours. Just amazing. And I will leave you with this final note. Yardbird, the cat that was on Guadalcanal on 27 March 1943, when VP-12 packed it in and was sent back to the States, aviation ordnanceman Eugene Davies took Yardbird with him, and Yardbird lived out his days happily in sunny Southern California. All right, guys, this was...
We hope you have enjoyed this Infinite Models presentation.